Hello again everyone. Today we're going to look at one of the most important skills that you can develop in English Literature A-Level. That is evaluating other people's opinions, critical interpretations of a text, and using your evaluations of their opinions to then come up with your own interpretations. You've already practiced this skill in your study of Shakespeare. When you balance one critical opinion, for example Anya Lumba's, against another critical opinion, say A.C. Bradley's, you're being evaluative. But then there are obviously good and bad ways, effective and less effective ways to evaluate. There are ways to approach an alternative reading of the text that help you to develop your own critical response. In this video, I'm going to give you a few examples, a few warnings too. Then you're going to find at least 5 alternative readings of your second coursework text, and you're going to evaluate those interpretations. My friend Mr. Davis is also an English teacher. We both teach Wordsworth. We might have completely different opinions on what Wordsworth's poems mean, and in fact, if we're worth our stripes as English teachers, we should disagree on at least some points, because that would show we've thought about Wordsworth's poetry in detail. I've got beef with Mr. Davis, because he says that Wordsworth is famous for his spiritual connection with nature. That's obviously not true. We all know that Wordsworth believed in pantheism. This is a poor evaluation of Mr. Davis's arguments, and for a couple of reasons. One, it's a personal attack on the critic, more than it is an engagement with his argument. Two, my argument against Mr. Davis relies on me knowing the technical term pantheism. It's as if the long word counts as having done some kind of in-depth thinking, which obviously I haven't. And then thirdly, I have clearly not thought my argument through, because pantheism could certainly be described as a kind of spiritual connection, in which case Mr. Davis is right. A more productive way for me to evaluate Mr. Davis's line of argument might go a little bit like this. Mr. Davis argues that Wordsworth's poem was deeply personal and charted his development from boy to man. This is clearly demonstrated in the structure of Wordsworth's prelude. Each of the 14 books seeing the boy Wordsworth develop in some key emotional or physical way. However, Mr. Davis continues by arguing that from this evidence we should infer a message that applies to all human beings, as if we all follow the developmental path that Wordsworth himself followed in the epic poem. Now, given the Romantic movement's obsession with the individual, and the fact that Wordsworth himself labelled it the prelude growth of a poet's mind, an autobiographical poem, shows us that he did not intend to describe general rules that apply to all human beings. This is specifically about his own life and his personal feelings, those of the singular, in some ways exceptional, poet. So to break down the structure of what makes a more effective evaluation, firstly you should summarise what the critic has argued. Then you should agree with at least one aspect of their argument, providing your own evidence from the text. That shows that this is a critic who is worth listening to at some level. Thirdly, you should explain which part of their argument you disagree with, and just use one specific bit, not the whole thing. And finally, provide evidence for your alternative interpretation. For your second coursework text, I know quite a lot of you have chosen to study The Great Gatsby. So let's have a look at a critic who's written about The Great Gatsby, in fact spoken about The Great Gatsby at an event at the British Library, and let's pick apart her argument. Sarah Churchwell has argued that the novel is, in one sense, about the failure of the education of Gatsby's imaginative life. His imaginative life is not susceptible to education. This makes him admirable and monstrous, an arrested adolescent. It also makes him stupid, which nobody likes to talk about. But from what little direct experience we have of him, J. Gatsby comes across as distinctly humourless, not to mention quite obsessive. I've said before that in a different kind of story, J. Gatsby would be a stalker, complete with his unsettling collection of photographs and cuttings about the ex-girlfriend whose loss he will not accept. Now, 2 parts of this argument jump out at me as being worth evaluating. But I have to consider carefully which will be more productive in helping me to make my overall argument about The Great Gatsby. We're not evaluating just for the sake of it. So I could either take objection to the idea that Gatsby is both admirable and monstrous, or the idea that he's stupid. Now, my overall argument might be that the novel, just as an example, is about Gatsby being a caricature. He's created to warn us of the dangers of American capitalism. So it would make sense for me to agree with Churchwell that Gatsby is monstrous. I could argue that her assertion that he's also at the same time admirable is wrong, but then I would have to navigate the fact that the whole of Fitzgerald's novel is written from the perspective of Nick Carraway, who seems besotted with Gatsby and describes in detail all the other people who are equally in love with him and his lifestyle. So it would be quite hard to argue against Churchwell's idea that he's admirable. Clearly some people admire him. So instead, I'll evaluate the idea that Gatsby is stupid. So our first step, summarise what the critic has argued. Churchwell argues that Gatsby is admirable but monstrous, and in his adolescent fantasies, stupid. Second step, agree with one aspect of the argument, providing your own evidence from the text. Clearly our narrator, Nick, is torn between condemning Gatsby and loving him. In a tone that is somewhat contradictorily admiring and repulsed, he tells us, "Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. No, Gatsby turned out all right in the end." Thirdly, explain which part of their argument you disagree with. However, Churchwell's assertion of Gatsby's stupidity fails to address the way Fitzgerald has Nick describe him as almost godlike in his ability to empathise and reassure. This may just be Nick having been taken in, duped, by Gatsby's winning ways, but then the reader is too. If Gatsby's stupid, then we all are. In which case, we have to deduce that Fitzgerald's accusation of stupidity is not aimed at an individual, rather at the institutions and culture of early 20th century America. And finally, provide evidence for your alternative interpretation. He smiled understandingly, much more than understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. Of course, you could argue for or against Churchwell's assertions in her article in plenty of other ways. I found Churchwell's argument by a little Google search which led me to the British Library website. You can see here how easy it was. The British Library website is full of other great resources for most of your key texts, and I would heartily recommend that you take a look at what they've got there for your second coursework text. Another great resource to have a look at is Google Scholar, a search engine particularly for articles and academic interpretations. Have a look at your text on here. Make sure that you try to whittle down your search terms by adding a few of the specific areas that you're interested in. So don't just write The Taming of the Shrew, put The Taming of the Shrew and feminism, and then that will lead you to a range of resources, some of which are free to access. And you've got to be a little bit patient to find the really good ones. And here's your task. You're going to do some searching, find some articles, find some critics, find some alternative interpretations, and then evaluate them in the way that I have shown you, creating a table with at least 5 secondary sources evaluated in it. Remember that the most important thing you're doing here is using these other critics and interpretations to bolster, to strengthen your own interpretation of your coursework texts. That is one of the mark scheme criteria, and it is what is going to give you the most original ideas to express in your coursework essays.